"Don't pull the arrow," she begged him. He pulled it anyway, and what happened next would cost him more than she ever knew, because the man who saved her was already bleeding out himself and had never said a single word about it. Arizona Territory, late summer of 1882. The San Pedro Valley. His name was Cole Garrett, and he rode that stretch of high desert like a man who had made peace with being alone and wasn't sure whether to regret it. He was 37 years old, sun-dark and quiet, with the kind of stillness in his face that comes either from grief or from a long time spent looking at empty country. Both were true, in his case. He had lost his wife Sarah to typhoid fever 4 years prior, and their infant son 2 months after that. And the ranch he had built near the Dragoon Mountains carried their absence the way a church carries the absence of people who no longer come to it. Still there, still shaped right, just emptied of the thing that made it mean something. He kept the ranch running, ran a small herd, mended fence, did his own doctoring, slept without dreaming much. The 2 ranch hands he employed were good men who knew not to ask him questions. On the days he rode the southern fence line alone, which was most days, the only sounds were the bay horses' shoes on the caliche and the ravens arguing in the mesquite. He wasn't looking for anything different. He had arrived at a version of his life that held together without hurting too much, and he was careful about it the way a man is careful about a healed rib. He knew how far he could push before it gave out again. Watch till the end of this story. If it moves you, a like and subscribe helps more than you know, because this one is worth hearing to the finish. Cole Garrett had been riding the eastern fence line since sunup, checking for breaks where the summer rains had undercut the posts. When he heard it, not a shout, something lower than that. A sound that was fighting not to be heard, like a person who needs help very badly, but has been taught that asking for it is worse than dying. He reined the bay in and sat still. The sound came again, from the far side of a low ridge, choked with ocotillo and chala. He stepped down from the saddle, tied the horse to a fence post, and moved through the brush on foot, because the ground there was too broken for a horse, and because something in his chest had gone very quiet in the way it did when the situation required him to move without announcing himself. He came over the ridge and stopped. There were 2 dead men at the base of the dry wash, both of them dressed rough, the kind of men who did other men's dirty work and didn't live long enough to grow old at it. They had died violently and recently. Their horses had run, and in the dry creek bed between them, a woman lay face down in the gravel with 2 arrows in her back. Cole crossed the wash in 6 steps. He crouched and put 2 fingers to the side of her neck. The pulse was there, thin, too fast, but there. She was Apache. He could see that from the cut of her dress and the beadwork on the band that held her hair. The arrows were iron-tipped trade arrows, which told him the men who'd shot her hadn't been Apache. They'd used Apache weapons to make it look otherwise. He had seen that trick before, and it moved a particular anger through him, the kind that didn't have anywhere useful to go right then. The arrow in her left shoulder had not gone deep. The one in her lower back was worse. It had gone in at an angle, and the tip had not come through the other side, which meant it was sitting against something inside her, and every breath she drew was teaching her what that felt like. He looked at the angle. He looked at her breathing. Then he did what he had to do. "Be still," he said. "I'm going to help you." She might not have understood the words, but she went very still under his hands, which told him she understood his tone. He got his boot knife out, cut the shaft of the lower arrow down close to the skin so he could manage it, and then he set both hands to the job and pushed the arrowhead the rest of the way through. It was the only way. Pulling it back would have torn her apart. She screamed. She couldn't help it. He finished the push, got the arrow clear, then sat back on his heels and pressed his bandana hard against the exit wound. She was shaking, her hands pressed flat into the gravel, breathing in a way that sounded like she was furious at the necessity of it. He had already been shot himself. He hadn't told her that. When the 2 men at the base of the wash had been alive, 10 minutes prior, one of them had put a pistol ball through Cole's left side, just above the hip, before Cole stopped the situation from getting any worse. He'd plugged the wound with a folded piece of shirt tail and cinched his belt tight over it, and told himself it was manageable. It was the kind of wound that stayed manageable if you were careful and got to proper treatment inside a few hours, and stopped being manageable if you forgot about it. He was doing his best to forget it, because she needed the attention more. He got her onto her horse. It had stayed ground-tied near the wash, which told him she had trained it well, and rode beside her the 4 miles back to his ranch, with one hand ready to catch her if she went sideways. She stayed on. Whatever she was made of, it was the hard kind. He got her inside and onto the cot in the spare room. She had passed out somewhere on the ride, which was probably Mercy. He cleaned the shoulder wound and the lower back wound. He had a kit. He'd used it on himself often enough to know what he was doing. He packed the wounds, bandaged them, and then sat down in the chair beside the cot, and felt the world tilt slightly in a way that told him his own blood was running faster than he'd accounted for. He retightened the belt. Then he started supper on the stove, because he was going to need his strength, and he was not the kind of man who waited around doing nothing while things went wrong. She woke the next morning while the sky outside was still more dark than light. Cole was asleep in the chair where he had spent the night. He came awake when she moved, which had been true of him since the fever took Sarah. He slept light now, the way people do after losing something without warning. She was looking at him. Her eyes were dark and steady, and carried an animosity that was not personal so much as architectural, the kind that gets built over years, brick by brick, by the weight of what your people have survived at the hands of other people, and by the time you meet a stranger, it is just part of how you see the world. He didn't take it personally. He understood it as a reasonable position given the evidence available to her. "Water," he said, and held up the tin cup. She didn't reach for it. "Set it there," he said to himself, and put it on the floor beside the cot within her reach. "Food when you want it. I'll keep clear." He moved toward the kitchen. He heard the sound of her reaching for the cup behind him and chose not to look back because he figured she'd find it easier to drink if he wasn't watching. Her name, he would learn over the following days, was Nayland. She was of the Chokanen band whose country had been the Dragoon Mountains and the high country south toward the border for as long as there had been Chokanen people to name a place. They were Cochise's people, and Cochise had been dead for 8 years, and the band was scattered now between the reservation and the mountains, and the memory of things that no longer existed in the form they once had. She was 24 years old. She had 2 brothers who were somewhere she was not allowed to say, and a mother who had died the previous winter, and she had been traveling alone toward the mountains when the 2 men found her and decided to prove something to themselves. Cole learned all of this slowly in the fitful way you learn things when 2 people share almost no language. She spoke some Spanish, which he spoke poorly but earnestly. He spoke exactly 12 words of her language, which she taught him, one at a time with the flat patience of someone who has decided to do a thing and intends to do it right. She did not trust him. She kept the water cup close. She watched the door. The first 2 nights she slept with her hand wrapped around the handle of the small knife she wore at her belt, and he was aware of it and did not comment because the knife was the correct decision given what she knew. If he had been in her position, he'd have done the same. What she did not know was that he was running a fever. He discovered it on the 3rd morning, when he stood up from the table and had to catch himself on the counter. The wound in his left side had gone quiet in the way wounds sometimes do before they go loud, and loud had arrived overnight. The flesh around the entry point was hot and swollen. He had a temperature. He stood at the kitchen counter and made his calculations with the same methodical calm he'd learned to apply to things he could not simply refuse to deal with. He was not in danger of dying that hour, probably not that day. If the infection moved fast and he did nothing, maybe 2 or 3 days before it became a question with a bad answer. His nearest neighbor was 11 miles west. Town was 2 hands were out on the far range, and would not be back until Friday. It was Tuesday. He went back to the cot which he had moved into the main room after she'd been well enough to sit up, because the spare room was hers, and he meant to keep it that way. He sat down carefully and picked up the mending he'd been doing to have something to do with his hands, and thought about his choices. He had been sitting there for about 20 minutes when she appeared in the doorway of the spare room, still moving slowly, one hand braced against the doorframe, and looked at him with the same flat, dark gaze she'd been training on him since she woke up. Then her gaze moved to his left side, to the place where he'd been cinching his belt, to the way he was holding himself. She came across the room. He said, "I'm fine." She crouched in front of him without a word, pulled his shirt aside, and looked at the wound. He heard the breath she let out through her nose. Not loud, but informative. She stood up, went to his kitchen, and began opening things. She found what she wanted and what she did not want and what was missing. She took her time about it. Then she came back and she pulled the chair close to the cot and she went to work. What she did was nothing like what he would have done. She used materials he would not have chosen and applied them in an order and combination that made no sense to him, until the fever broke 20 hours later and he understood she had known exactly what she was doing. He slept almost through those 20 hours, which was the deepest he had slept in 4 years. When he woke up, the fever was gone, and the wound was packed and dressed in a way that bore no resemblance to anything in his kit, and smelled faintly of sage and something else he couldn't name. And she was asleep in the chair beside the cot, with her arms crossed and her chin down. He lay there in the quiet of the early morning, and looked at her and thought about all the things he had assumed he had finished with. The storm that had been building since the end of August came in on a Thursday. It arrived the way summer storms do in that country, fast and total, the sky going from bruised purple to nearly black in an hour, the wind eating the heat out of the air and replacing it with something that smelled like the inside of a quarry. Lightning stood up over the dragoons and walked slow. The rain came in a curtain. Cole had seen the signs and spent the morning closing things up. Nayland had been on her feet for 2 days by then, moving carefully but moving, and she helped him without being asked. She read the weather better than he did. She had the knowledge of someone whose survival had long depended on knowing what the sky intended, and when she looked at the western horizon and began taking things inside, Cole followed her lead and didn't ask questions. When the storm broke, they were inside, and they stayed there. The ranch house was a good building. He had built it himself, low and solid, with thick adobe walls and deep window sills, and the roof had held through worse. The sound of rain on it was almost domestic, almost like something from a life he had stopped living. The first evening of the storm they ate supper at the same table for the first time. He had made beans and salt pork and cornbread, the plain provisions of a man whose cooking was purely functional. She had watched him cook from the kitchen doorway for a while, and then, without comment, had taken over the cornbread and done something to it he couldn't identify, added a pinch of something from a small packet she kept in her things, and the result was better than anything he'd put on a table in 4 years. He said so in English, and from the way she looked at him, he suspected she understood it even if the specific words didn't land. After supper she taught him a word in her language. He repeated it back badly. She corrected him. He tried again. She made a sound that might, in a less guarded person, have been the beginning of something like amusement. He tried a third time. The sound she made was clearer that time, though still brief. He filed it away. On the second day of the storm they talked more. His Spanish improved under pressure, which was how his Spanish had always worked. She told him about the dragoon country as it had been when she was a girl, the way the light came through the rock formations in the morning, the particular quality of the springs in the high country, the routes through the mountains that her father had walked her as soon as she was old enough to walk them. She described it without sentimentality, which he found he respected. She was not describing a paradise. She was describing a place she knew. He told her about the ranch, about Sarah and the boy. He had not said those names to another person in longer than he could precisely calculate, and when he said them now they did not break him the way he had expected them to. They sat in his mouth like stones, present, real, weighty, but they did not destroy anything. He said them, and the room did not change, and Nayland listened without making the face people made when they were trying to decide what to say. She just listened. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said a word he didn't know, and when she saw his face, she found the Spanish for it, which was something close to "those who stay with us." He didn't say anything for a while after that, but he thought about it. On the third day of the storm, she asked him about the wound in his side. Not how he'd gotten it, she had pieced that together, but why he had said nothing. He thought about how to answer that honestly. "You needed the attention more," he said. She considered that for a long time. "No one has done such a thing for me," she said finally, in careful Spanish. He shook his head. Anyone would. She looked at him with something that was not quite pity and not quite anger, and not quite the flat wall she had brought in from the beginning. It was something in between those things that he did not have a word for and did not try to name. "No," she said, "they would not. The rain kept on. They let it. She had been teaching him things throughout the storm without framing it as teaching, which he understood was the polite way to do it. She showed him how to use the materials she had gathered, mesquite bark, the inner part of certain dried roots, a preparation made from something she'd found at the edge of the ranch that he walked past every day and had assumed was just brush. She simply included him, the way you include someone when you've decided they might be worth including. The second day of the storm, she also showed him how she had packed his wound while he slept. She walked him through it without words, pointing to each step in sequence, making sure he could repeat it back in the right order. She watched his hands when he tried. She corrected where he was wrong without making a production of the correction, just moved his hand to the right position and held it there a moment, and then stepped back. He understood that she was teaching him to look after himself if she was not there to do it, which was not a gentle thing to teach someone, but was a real one. He showed her things, too, how the rain catchment on the roof worked, which she found worth examining because water management in that country was never incidental. How he read the fence lines to know when deer had come through in the night, how he hung the tack so nothing rotted, the accumulated logic of a man who had paid attention to one small piece of ground for 11 years. She paid attention to all of it. That was something he noticed about her. When she looked at something, she actually saw it, not the general shape of it, but the specific thing. She had that quality. He suspected she had always had it, and that it had kept her alive more than once. The third day she asked him why he lived alone. Not the fact of it, she understood the grief, but the continuance of it. 4 years was a long time to choose solitude, and she was curious enough about the choice to ask. He sat with that question for a while before he answered. Then he said he wasn't sure it had been a choice, so much as the absence of one, that grief takes up the space where choices usually live. And after a while you look up and realize you have been doing the same day over and over for longer than you intended. She said she understood that. After her mother died, she had gone 3 months without making any decision larger than which direction to walk in the morning. Some days she had made that decision badly, he said. You seem like someone who makes decisions well. She said, now, yes, then, no. He thought about the version of himself 4 years ago, standing in the cabin doorway looking at a world that had stopped making sense. He supposed nobody looks competent in the middle of grief. You just look like what you are, which is someone in the middle of grief. He said, you came out the other side. So did you, she said. He considered that. He had not thought of himself as having come through so much as having arrived at a kind of stable damage. But she said it with a matter-of-factness that made him think maybe the distinction was not as large as he'd always held it to be. On the 4th day the rain softened to a steady drizzle, and they were both on their feet, both healing, both aware in the way you become aware of someone when you have been close to them for 4 days, without the usual buffer of distance and social habit. He found himself noticing the way she moved through the room, economical and certain, nothing wasted. She found herself, he thought, noticing him in the same way. He caught her watching his hands once when he was fixing the hinge on the window shutter, the way you watch hands when you are deciding what kind of person they belong to. He mended the shutter, he set the kettle on, she sat at the table and braided something from a length of cord she'd taken from her pack. He didn't ask what it was. The silence between them had changed. It had been a wall. Then it had been a gap. Now it was something else, something he did not have a name for yet. But it did not make him uneasy. He had lived with silence long enough to know its different textures. This one was comfortable in the way very few things had been comfortable for him in 4 years. He poured the coffee. He set a cup in front of her without asking. She wrapped her hands around it and looked at him over the rim. That was all. But it was something. The 5th day the sun came back and everything steamed and the desert showed its second face, the one that only appears after enough rain. The green underneath the things that had been waiting all summer to open, the smell of wet earth turning toward something living. The mountains to the east came in sharp and clear, every crease and ledge rendered precise against a sky that had been washed so clean it hurt to look at. Cole walked the fence line to assess the damage. Nayland walked with him. She had not asked to. She had simply appeared at his shoulder when he put his hat on, and he had not suggested otherwise. They found 3 posts down where the arroyo had run hard. He had a post digger, and she held the posts, and they did not talk much while they worked, because the work didn't require it. When they were done, she stood looking south, toward the mountains, with an expression he read as both longing and calculation. He understood what that meant. "When you're healed enough," he said. She looked at him. "You do not need to keep me here." "I don't," he agreed. "But you're not ready yet, and the men who shot you may still be in the area. I'd like to know you got there." She studied his face for a moment. Then she turned back to the mountains. "My people believe there is a thread," she said in Spanish, touching the small cord bracelet she had finished braiding 3 days ago, which she now wore on her left wrist. "Between people who have saved each other's lives, it does not break." He looked at the bracelet. He looked at the mountains. He did not say anything because the thing he might have said was bigger than the moment, and he had learned a long time ago to let big things come in their own time. It was on the 8th day that the riders appeared at the southern ridge. Cole saw them first because he was up at dawn the way he always was, standing on the porch with his coffee, watching the light come over the dragoons. 3 of them, working their way along the high ground, making no attempt to be unseen. That told him something. Men who move that openly are either lost or they want to be spotted, and these men did not look lost. He set his coffee down and went inside. She was awake. She had heard the horses. "Stay inside," he said. She met his eyes. "No." He opened his mouth to argue, and she said calmly, "I will not hide behind you." He studied her for 1 second. Then he handed her the spare pistol from the drawer under the kitchen counter, the smaller one that would fit her hand better than the Colt he wore. And he said, "Kitchen door. If they come around the east side." She checked the load and said, "Yes." He went out onto the porch. The 3 men came down off the ridge at a walk, making a show of keeping their hands visible, which was the oldest trick there was because it gave them something to lower when the time came. Cole stood on the porch with his thumbs hooked in his belt and said nothing while they covered the last 100 yards. He recognized one of them from town, a man named Houck who ran with the Dalton outfit, or what was left of it. The other 2 he'd never seen. Houck stopped his horse at the gate. "Rancher," he said, "we're looking for something that went missing." "Figure it ended up here," Cole said. "Nothing missing here. Apache woman." Wounded, Houck's eyes moved to the windows of the house. "Word is, you found her out on the San Pedro line." "Word," Cole said, "gets around, belongs to someone. The specific anger he had felt in the wash 8 days ago came back, and he let it sit in his chest without showing it in his face. He said, 'She doesn't belong to anyone.'" Houck smiled in the way men smile when they have already decided how a thing is going to end and are enjoying the interval before it does. "Now, Garrett, ride out," Cole said. The 2 men on either side of Houck moved their horses apart by about 3 yards each, a tactical spread meant to be noticed. Cole noticed it. He also noticed that his angle on the man to the right meant he could take him first if it came to it, and the man to the left would need a half-second to clear his holster because of the way he sat the saddle. He had made these calculations before. He did not enjoy making them, which was exactly why he was still alive. "Last chance," Houck said. The shot came from the kitchen doorway. It was a single shot, placed precisely, and it took Houck's hat off his head and put a hole through the crown that could not have been accidental. The hat dropped in the dust 6 feet away. All 3 men froze. "Next one," Nayland said from the doorway, in clear and careful English that nobody had known she possessed, "is not the hat." There was a silence that lasted several seconds. The man to the right looked at Houck. The man to the left looked at his hat on the ground. Houck looked at Cole. Cole said, "I'd take her at her word." Houck reached down very slowly and picked up his hat, and looked at the hole in it, and then looked at the kitchen doorway for a long moment. Then he turned his horse around. The 2 men followed him without another word. They went back up the ridge the way they had come, and did not look back. Cole waited until they were out of sight. Then he walked to the kitchen doorway. She was standing there with the pistol lowered, watching the ridge. "You're English," he said. "Better than my Spanish," she said. "I simply chose not to use it." He looked at her for a moment, then he laughed. It was a short sound, unpracticed, the laugh of a man who had not used it in a while and was surprised to find it still worked. She looked at him, and the expression on her face was something he had not seen there before. Not quite amusement, something quieter. Something that was deciding something. "Come inside," she said. "You are pale." He was pale. The standing he'd done on the porch had cost him more than he'd budgeted. He went inside and sat at the table, and she checked his wound, the way she had been checking it for days. With the same exact attention she gave everything, and told him it was closing properly, but that he needed 2 more days at minimum before he did anything requiring that much stillness under pressure. "One wound at a time," she said. He said, "I'm starting to hear that as a personal principle." She looked at him. He thought he might be getting better at reading her expressions, because the one she wore now seemed like it agreed with him, without wanting to say so directly. He said, "The men will come back." "Yes," she said. "Or others. Yes, you should be in the mountains," he said, "with your people. Yes." Neither of them said anything for a moment. "I could ride with you," he said. "When you're ready, make sure you get there." She was quiet long enough that he thought he might have misjudged the moment. Then she said, "The thread," and touched the bracelet on her wrist. "The thread," he agreed. She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning light through the kitchen window fell across the table between them, and the house did not feel empty in the way it had felt empty for 4 years. She said, "There is something I wish to ask you. Ask it, if I return," she said, choosing the words slowly, "to the mountains, and if I do not want to go alone, and if you were to come not only to see me there safely, but because you wished to stay." She stopped. She was not the kind of woman who said things she had not already thought through, so he understood she was done and that the rest of it was in the space she'd left. He looked at his hands on the table. He thought about Sarah, about how she had been someone he could talk to and how rare that was, and how 4 years without it had felt like trying to read in bad light. You kept going, but something was perpetually strained. He thought about the word Nayland had given him on the 2nd day of the storm. "Those who stay with us." He said, "I don't know the first thing about living in that country." "I know it," she said. He said, "Your people may not want a white rancher walking into the mountains with you. That is for my people to decide," she said, "and for me to speak to." He said, "I have a ranch to account for." "Yes," she said, "that is a real thing. I am not asking you to forget it exists." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What are you asking?" She looked at him steadily. "I am asking if you would like to try." He had not been asked that. Not in 4 years. Not since the morning Sarah had said over breakfast, with total simplicity, "I would like to try having a child." And they had tried, and the child had come. And then the fever had come after it, and Cole had spent 4 years in the silence of a house that had tried and not gotten to keep what it was trying for. He looked at the woman across the table. Her dark eyes were steady and honest, and there was nothing in her face that promised him anything beyond exactly what she had said. She was not offering him Sarah back. She was not offering him the life he had before. She was offering him something else, something that was itself, and the honesty of it was the most convincing thing about it. He said, "Yes, I would." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked down at the table, and something in her shoulders changed very slightly, the way a thing changes when it has been held up by effort for a long time and is allowed to simply rest. She said a word in her language. He said, "What does that mean?" She considered. Then she said, in Spanish, "It means something like good, and something like I was hoping." They left on the 12th day, when both of them were well enough to ride without the ride reopening what had closed. Cole had written a letter to his hired men and left it on the kitchen table, explaining he would be away for some time and that they should keep the place running the way he knew they would. He had put enough money in an envelope beside it to cover the next several months, and the horse sale he'd been planning. He packed light. He had been light all his life. Nallen had her horse and her pack, and the small inventory of her knowledge which weighed nothing and was worth more than anything he was leaving behind. They rode south through the late summer desert, which had turned green and strange after the storm, the grass already reaching for light, the prickly pear fat with water, the distant mountains showing colors he had never quite seen them show before, a range of purple and copper and ochre that changed as the sun moved. He said something about it, and she told him the names for those colors in her language, and he tried to say them, and mostly failed. and she corrected him. And somewhere in the middle of a second attempt he realized he was not being careful the way he had been careful for 4 years, not moving like a man protecting a rib. He was just riding. The Dragoon Mountains were 3 days south and east. They took their time. The first night they camped near a spring she knew, and she showed him how to read the ground around a spring, for signs of who had come and gone, which was knowledge he understood the value of immediately. He made the fire, and she made the meal, and they ate in the companionable quiet that had come to feel ordinary over the course of the storm. She pointed out a hawk riding the last thermal of the evening, and told him its name in 2 languages. He looked at it against the darkening sky for a while, and then looked at the fire. Sarah had liked evenings, he thought. She would have understood this one. He said, out loud and without planning to, "She would have liked you." Nayland looked at him. She understood who he meant. "Tell me about her," she said. So he did. He had not talked about Sarah in 4 years. Not properly, not the way you talk about someone when you want to give the other person an actual picture of them. He told Nayland about how Sarah had been fearless about practical things, and afraid of thunderstorms, which she would never admit, so she pretended she was simply choosing to watch them from inside. He told her about the way Sarah made coffee stronger than it needed to be, because she believed weak coffee was a character failing. He told her about the morning the boy was born, and the particular quality of the light in the room, the way everything that mattered had seemed to be right there inside those 4 walls, and how he had known even then that he would carry that moment for the rest of his life. Nayland listened. She did not hurry him past the grief. She sat with it the way she sat with most things, present and still, and prepared to stay as long as the thing required. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She sounds like someone who knew what she had." He looked at the fire. She did. Nayland said, "I think you did too." He had not let himself believe that for a while. It was a useful thought. He stored it somewhere he could reach later. She told him about her own mother that night, about the knowledge her mother had carried, plants, weather, healing, the particular way the desert gave signals if you knew how to wait for them, and how she had learned it all in the way children learn things from someone they love, not as instruction, but as conversation, as weather, as the ordinary texture of being in the same space. Her mother had died in February of a fever that had moved fast, and she had been alone since then in a way that was different from solitude, the way the absence of one particular person is different from simple aloneness. He understood that distinction very well. They reached the Dragoon Mountains on the 3rd afternoon. Nayland rode the last mile with a certainty in her body that was different from her usual certainty, something less guarded, more open. She was home. He could see it in the way she read the ground, in the way she turned her face toward a smell he couldn't identify and relaxed at whatever it told her. They were met 3 miles into the mountain country by 2 young men who appeared from behind a rock formation without any prior warning and stood in the trail with their hands on the knives at their belts, looking at Cole with the kind of assessment that didn't waste time on formalities. Nayland spoke to them at length. She spoke for several minutes, direct and unhurried, and they listened to her because she was clearly someone whose words were worth listening to. One of them looked at Cole's left side, at the place where the wound had been, in a way that suggested Nayland had just mentioned it. Both of them looked at Cole's face. Then one of them said something to Nayland. She said something back. There was a pause. He said to Cole, in rough English that carried its meaning clearly, "You helped her." Cole said, "We helped each other." The young man looked at him for another moment, then he stepped to the side of the trail. They rode on up into the mountains. The days that followed were unlike any Cole Garrett had lived. He was conspicuous in that country, and some of the people he encountered read him with the same flatness Nayland had turned on him at the beginning. He did not argue with it. He did not perform. He helped with what needed helping, stayed out of things that were not his business, and paid attention to everything, because Nayland had taught him that paying attention was the basic courtesy this country expected. She was different here, still precise, still economical, but opened in a way he hadn't seen. She talked more. She laughed sometimes, a sound that was so unguarded he had to consciously not look at her when it happened, the way you don't look directly at something you don't want to frighten away. She moved through the camp with a sureness of purpose that told him she was someone here, not just anyone. Someone the older women spoke to with a particular weight of consideration, someone the children moved toward without thinking about it. The children were the first ones to show him any warmth unfiltered by caution. They watched him for half a day and then decided he was acceptable, on grounds that had everything to do with the fact that when one of the smaller ones tripped over a stone near the fire, he caught her without thinking, set her back on her feet, and said nothing. The child looked at him, decided he was fine, and ran off. By that evening, 3 of them had figured out that he would answer questions about the horses if they asked, which they did at length, in a mixture of her language and Spanish that he followed about half of. Nalin watched this from across the camp with an expression he could not fully read. When he caught her eye, she looked away, but not before he had noticed something in her face that was different from anything he had seen there during the storm. He didn't analyze it. He let it be what it was. He found himself liking what he saw, not just the face he'd looked at across the kitchen table for 12 days. The whole of her. She introduced him to her uncle, an older man named Nahilze, who had the kind of authority that comes not from being told you have it, but from being consistently correct for long enough that everyone around you starts paying attention when you speak. He had a long, deliberate conversation with Cole, through Nalin as the interpreter, the kind of conversation that is not adversarial, but is also not casual, that is taking the measure of something and doing it carefully. At the end of it, Nahilze said something to Nalin. She translated, "He says that a man who keeps a wound to himself so that someone else can be helped first is either a fool or someone with good values. He says he has not yet decided which." Cole said, "Probably both." Nahilze looked at him for a moment when that was translated. Then he made a sound like the sound Nalin had made on the second day of the storm, the one he had eventually decided was amusement. He was in the mountains for 3 weeks before the conversation happened that he had known was coming. He and Nalin were sitting above the camp, at a place where the rock gave way to a view of the valley below that stretched so far south he could not see the end of it. The evening was one of those evenings that comes at the end of summer in the high country, when the heat of the day is done, and the air is exactly the right weight and the light goes gold on everything it touches. She was quiet for a while. He was quiet with her. Then she said, "You have a ranch." "I do," he said. "It is a real thing," she said. "I have been thinking about what that means." "So have I," she said. "I cannot live on a ranch in the valley. Not now. What is here is mine, and I cannot leave it while it is what it is." "I know that," he said. She said, "But you could live some of your life there and some of it here, if you chose to." He said, "I have been thinking about that." And he looked at the valley. He thought about the house with no one in it, and the fence line he'd been riding alone for 4 years, and the coffee that sat in the pot getting cold because there was no one to drink it with him. He looked at her. He said, "I would like to talk to Nahilze." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "About what exactly?" he said. "About whether a man in my particular situation would be allowed to make a particular kind of question to someone." She looked at him. In the evening light, her face was very still, and he had learned to read that stillness well enough now to know it was not the wall. It was the other kind, the kind that was listening hard. "And what question would that be?" she said. He said, "The one I think you already know." She looked at him for a long moment. The valley fell away below them in the last of the light, and the mountains held them both in the particular silence of high places, and she said nothing for long enough that he had time to wonder whether he had misjudged everything. Then she reached across the space between them and put her hand over the back of his hand where it rested on the rock. She said, "Ask the question." He said, "Will you marry me?" Nellin. He did not say it like a question, because it was not really a question, it was a statement of the direction he intended to go, offered to her for her judgment, and he thought she would understand the difference. She did. She said, "Yes, Cole Garrett." And then she took her hand back and looked out at the valley the same way she had been looking at it before, only something about the set of her shoulders was different, and after a while he understood that what he was looking at was a woman who had already decided something a while ago, and had just been waiting to see if the other person was going to catch up. He supposed he was catching up. The ceremony was a month later, on a morning when the aspens at the upper elevation had gone gold, and the air was cold enough in the early hours that breath showed. Nahilze presided. It was done in her language, which he understood only pieces of, and he stood through it, paying attention the way she had taught him to pay attention, which meant watching what the words meant on the faces around him, rather than trying to decode the words themselves. There was a moment when Nihilze bound their wrists together with a length of braided cord, not the bracelet she wore, but a new one made for this, and said something that Nayland translated in a murmur, the same word she had given him on the second night of the storm, the word for those who stay with us. He repeated it back in her language imperfectly, and the people around them made the sound of something landing right. She looked at him. He looked at her. There was nothing that needed to be said right then that the looking didn't say more cleanly. Later that morning, when the ceremony was done and the food was being laid out, and the camp had moved into the particular warmth of a celebration, she rolled up the sleeve of her dress and showed him the healed scar on her shoulder from the arrow he had pulled. He pushed up the tail of his shirt and showed her the scar on his left side. She looked at his. He looked at hers. She said, "Matched." He said, "Matched." She took his hand, not in the urgent way of danger or the practical way of work, but in the simple way of someone who has decided this is the place their hand belongs and is no longer making arguments about it. He held on. He would hold the ranch half the year and the mountain country the other half, and it would not be a perfect arrangement because no arrangement is, and there would be years that were hard in the way years get hard. But there would also be mornings like this, one, gold and cold and clear, with a woman beside him who had saved his life and let him save hers, and had never once pretended that made anything simple. It did not make it simple. It only made it worth it. Two wounded people, healed by the same hands that could not quite heal themselves alone. Two scars matched. Two lives that had been torn open and closed again. Not back into the original shape, but into something new that held. He had ridden that San Pedro fence line looking for a break that needed mending. He had found something else instead. He had not been looking for it. That was the part he thought about in the years that came after, when the question of how a life changes direction came up. He had been riding along, doing the ordinary work of an ordinary day, and the world had opened up and offered him a different life, and all he had to do was stop and look at what was in front of him, and hold the wound he couldn't afford to, and let someone else be the one who found it. That was the whole of it. Two people, two wounds, and the grace of a moment when neither looked away.